Duchess of Wyre, Dishonour, Wrath and Lust. Chapter 1, Tragedies of the Yesterday and Embarrassments of Today. The horses ran almost wildly under the thick curtain of rainwater, in the midst of that storm almost as terrible as the biblical deluge that the parish priest often spoke of in his sermons. That horrible stormy night that was just beginning, dark as the omens it brought with it, with the darkness barely interrupted by the lightning flash, was the perfect representation of that apocalyptic deluge with which the pastor intended to scare his parishioners to follow the mandates of God according to the interpretation of the Church of England. The four steeds made their way through the water and the wind, and the cold that entered the bones of the riders. Those men would be shivering with cold if it were not because the energetic physical exercise of the crazed cavalcade and the mixed feelings that nested in their breasts did not warm them despite the freezing wind and rain. In that frantic and reckless race, almost suicidal, in which they ran on swampy and slippery terrain, avoiding the natural obstacles of a path that went through a forest, these men pursued their objective as a predator hungry for their prey. And at the head of them was he, the man who led them, driven by hatred and especially by fear, because he feared to lose what he loved most in the world. That man and his companions could well serve as inspiration for another sermon of the pastor, for they seemed the embodiment of the horsemen of the apocalypse. Although now, lashed by the raging tempest, and running the risk of their horses slipping or tripping and they could fall and break their necks, they were like castaways struggling not to drown and reach the coast. But their leader would not give up, and those who followed him would not abandon him, two of them out of loyalty to their master and another out of affection or love. The leader, the man who commanded, had under his coat and his cloak, 2 pistols ready to be used when his pursuit began, although now it was very likely that the gunpowder was wet and useless. But he also wore a sword and a dagger, and his companions were also armed. The man had his eyes pinned to the front, looking anxiously to see the object of his concern and the captors who had snatched it from his side. When he thought of them, his hatred grew louder and he felt the desire tear them apart with his own hands. One of the horses almost slipped and its rider had to make an effort not to lose his balance and fall, and then to force the steed to run again, to try to catch up with the other riders who had left him behind. A scream was heard. It was a warning scream from one of the men it addressed to the leader, who just in time noticed that there was a branch crossed on the path, but instead of stopping he spurred his horse and the magnificent animal jumped above the branch. The man who followed him out of devotion born of love imitated his example, but the other men had to stop when their horses were clearly frightened and reluctant to jump. The leader's friend shouted at them, without stopping, to go around the path through the grove and join them later. Then the man shouted at the leader, at his friend, to be careful, but his scream was drowned out by the thunderous noise of thunder. When they advanced a little more, another lightning bolt fell not far from them, fulminating at a tree. The horses whinnied in fright and tried to stop, but the men whipped and spurred them and did not allow them to stop. The man in front felt the rainwater mingling with the moisture of his tears, and his heart oppressed in his chest, with pain and fear drowning him. I should not lose him, I should not. And then he saw them. They were a distant image, but he knew it was them. He would have known even if they had been as far away as that moon almost hidden by the dark clouds lit intermittently by the flashes of lightning. He spurred the horse further and saw the river running through the forest, and he heard the loud, almost deafening noise of the water that ran raging in the flood of the river. And when he reached the shore he felt terror seize his body and his soul. The river had grown too much and apparently too soon, and a cart had been stuck in the water, far enough from the shore where the terrified man was staring at the scene, and closer to the opposite shore, but not near enough. A man was standing next to the horse pulling the cart, and struggling desperately to reassure the animal and try to pull on the cart, which was dangerously tilted to the side. On the cart was a young woman covered with a cloak and a hood, who screamed and cried hysterically, while hugging against her chest a little boy that clung scared to her and that also shouted and cried. The man who led the group of riders and who was now scared to death tried to force his horse into the river, but the animal resisted crazily and finally got up on its 2 hind legs and threw its rider, who fell on the muddy ground, and then the steed fled in the direction of the forest they had left behind. The man's faithful friend arrived on his own horse and got off on the run, and threw himself on his knees to help the one lying on the ground. Soon the fallen man sat up stunned in the arms of his friend, and after a few moments reacted and stood up. And then he started screaming, "Joseph! Joseph!" The desperate man shouted. The three figures in the cart turned to see the man, and the boy began to scream something that the noise of the furious current of the river and the storm drowned it and made almost inaudible, but still, the man and his friend managed to hear. "Papa, Papa!" The boy shouted hysterically. He tried to jump into the water when he heard his son's scream, but his friend grabbed him and they both struggled. At that moment the other two riders arrived and got off their horses, and helped to hold the crazed man so that he would not endanger his own life trying to save his son. Seeing them, the man who was fighting with the horse beside the cart drew a gesture on his face that was a mixture of fear, anger, and hatred. And then he raised his riding whip and lashed the horse, in a desperate and absurd attempt to force it to pull hard and pull the cart out of its quagmire. But the beast twisted and shook violently, trying to break free of its bonds, the man who was whipping it and the water that threatened to drag it, knocking down the man who fell into the water. The horse pulled so violently that it caused the cart lean more on the side to which it was already leaning, and the torrential force of the water did the rest. The vehicle rose violently and overturned, throwing the woman and child into the raging water. The boy's father stirred on the opposite bank and tried to get into the river, but the other three men fought him and threw him on the muddy ground, to avoid it. "William, you cannot do it. It would be suicide." His friend yelled desperately as he struggled to hold him down. "Let go of me, let me go!" the father of the child cried. Meanwhile, in the whirlwind of violent waters, three people fought to save themselves. The man who had dealt with the horse that pulled the cart struggled to reach the woman and child who had been dragged by the water to the deepest and most abundant part of the river, where the waters were more wild and violent. The mother and her son waved their arms energetically, the boy trying to cling to his mother. But the woman was too terrified and felt that her body was sinking, with her heavy and cumbersome clothes making it easy to submerge her, without her clumsy attempts to stay afloat served as something, while her son clinging to her neck made it more difficult. Their companion came to them just in time to pull the woman with a hand before she completely submerged, while with difficulty he tried to stay afloat with his other arm when a blow of water dragged them to the three. On the other shore the four men who had come riding stopped struggling and stand up, and they ran along the shore to see where the water dragged the three people. "Get back to the horses and bring ropes!" the friend of the boy's father shouted at another of the men, who immediately complied with his orders. The men, under the heavy rain, watched as the whirlwind of water dragged the three of them. The woman's companion managed to cling with one arm to an enormous branch fallen on the river, and with the hand of his other arm, he held an arm of the woman to prevent the current from dragging her. In turn, the woman held her son's hand, but the child was being dragged as if there were a giant in the water, an ogre that pulled him by the feet. "Do not let him go!" the child's father shouted from the shore as he ran desperately towards the point where the tragedy was happening. But at that moment the flood of water brought with it a pile of forest debris that it had ripped away, and a piece of branch struck the arm of the woman with whom she was holding the child and violently separated mother and son. A horrible scream of terror came from the child's throat, which those present would never forget in the years they would have to live. "No!" the father of the child shouted, while his companions had to hold him back. The child's mother also shouted, while her companion held her to keep her afloat. The child disappeared, swallowed by the water quickly, and it was as if he had evaporated in the air. There was no trace of him, his life extinguished in the turbulent waters. The father of the child cried and screamed, howled like a wounded animal, or like a wild beast that had seen its whelps killed by another predator. Lying on the ground, on his knees, in the incessant rain, he had seen the person he loved most in life die, and suddenly his life had collapsed, it had stopped making sense. His body trembling, his vision blurred, and that feeling of unreality that suffers people who have just suffered a shocking, traumatic event. Sunk, destroyed, he heard the screams that came from the water. His wife, the mother of his son, the one responsible for the death of the child along with her lover, that man with whom she was now in the water, the other murderer. He turned to see them with a look full of hatred and pain, and he did not stop seeing them while the man took the woman to the opposite shore. And a new reason to live seized him, a reason that would lead him to descend to hell, that would corrupt his soul, and condemn him to live without peace or consolation. 11 years later, in 1770, in a place near Poulton, in a mountainous hundred, Lancashire, northwest England, William woke again abruptly. Once again the nightmare had returned to torment him. The stormy night in which his son died, the night his life ended. He needed a couple of minutes to calm down, to become aware of his surroundings and remember that he was in his bed, in his bedroom. He raised his head and saw that some rays of light filtered into the bedroom, through the crack between the heavy drapes that covered the window of the room. The heavy burgundy-colored curtains were not in their best condition and looked somewhat deteriorated over the years, and were also covered with some dust as if cleaning was a neglected task in that part of the residence. William looked around the bedroom and saw an empty bottle lying on the floor, on the carpet, in a corner. There were 2 more bottles on a table, one empty and the other less than half. There were also leftovers of food in 2 plates next to the bottles. On a chair, on the dresser furniture and on the floor there were clothes in disarray, mixed and thrown carelessly, clothes of him and others that were not. Looking at another corner, in which there was a huge mirror, he saw his own reflection, on the enormous 4-poster bed. He was naked, just like the 2 women who were still sleeping next to him. He saw them without any emotion, in particular, 2 very young girls, one was 17 years old and the other 19, although they looked even younger. Both of them with white skin, the one who was more old with blonde and straight hair, the youngest with curly and dark hair. The youngest had big breasts, the more old one not so much, and William observed the large aureoles and the delicious nipples of the 17-year-old girl's breasts, those breasts that had been in her mouth and on her hands last night. The youngest one slept on her side, in a fetal position, and the older one slept hugging her in a spoon position, and William thought that maybe they used to sleep like that together. Then he turned to see the faces of the 2 sleeping girls, so angelic, so childish, and thought that anyone seeing them like that would not imagine that they were prostitutes, accustomed to giving pleasure to all kinds of men in every conceivable way, satisfying desires more perverse. The images of the nightmare returned to his mind and he felt again the tiredness and the sad bitterness that had accompanied him day after day when he woke up during all those years. Slowly he stood up, careful not to wake the girls up, not so much out of consideration for them but out of a desire to be a few minutes alone. He walked naked toward the window, and with one hand he moved the curtains a little to see outside. He was a tall man, 6 feet tall, and of more or less athletic build, with strong arms and legs, almost flat belly, and hard pecs. His skin was white, but with that tonality that sometimes made it look slightly tanned. His hair was dark brown, with some gray, and it was half curly, and his eyes were green. His face was attractive and very manly and looked about 40 years old. As he looked through the window, he once again thought with the irony of how beautiful the sight of his lands was for anyone but him. With a sigh, he took the half-empty bottle from the table and raised it to his lips, and he took a sip of whiskey, feeling the taste of the liquor mixed with the aftertaste of the breath of his mouth without washing yet. He felt a slight headache and feared it would be worse later for the hangover, but that did not stop him from having another good drink from the bottle. "Your Grace, what you do awake?" asked the blonde girl, who had woken up and watched him from the bed with a flirtatious and malicious smile, while her brunette companion stretched like a cat, stretching her arms. William turned around and stared at them, shamelessly showing his genitals in front. "I would have liked to continue sleeping, but I had a dream, with wild horses, and I woke up." "I hope I did not wake you 2 up, I tried to be silent," answered William kindly, but not excessively affectionate, maintaining some emotional distance. "No, do not worry, Your Grace, on the contrary, I am delighted to see that you are awake, very awake," replied the blonde, seeing with effrontery the naked crotch of William. "Actually, what I wanted to say is that, what do you up instead of being here in bed with us?" She added. "I say the same, Your Grace, why do not you come to play a little more with us?" said the other girl, the brunette, with a seductive smile and a malicious gesture on her face. William smiled with mocking irony and some trace of sadness, and leaving the bottle on the table, walked towards the bed. "It is my duty to please the ladies," said William in a hoarse voice, not without desire. He went to bed and kissed the brunette on the lips, then the blonde, and then they made him lie on his back, while they both slept on top of him and began the preliminary games for a new session of sex. A few days later, in a country house north of the city of Salisbury, in the southwest of England, the arrival of carriages had been incessant throughout the day, transporting the guests of the Marquis of Tidworth. Carriages loaded with trunks with the luggage of the aristocrats and their families, who did not want to deprive themselves of anything during their stay in the residence of their illustrious amphitryon. The lackeys rushed to help the guests and their respective servants to settle, and the activity was frenetic in the kitchens and in the rest of the dependencies of the servants. The mansion was built of brick with painted stone cladding and had a slate roof. The facade had a central triangular pediment set against a hipped roof with dormers and a sweep of steps leading to a carved stone door case. The huge house had wings on the sides of the central body, with rows of painted sash windows and stone coins emphasizing corners. The first reception of those days of festivities in the house of the Marquis was, as always, an occasion for the hosts and their guests to show off their wealth. Women dressed in their flashy and elegant dresses, each wearing her respective corset with wails, her bodice with a wide neckline, and flared skirt. And the men dressed also elegantly, with pants that reached just below the knee, vests and coats. At the reception, there were several beautiful women, mostly married. One of the most beautiful of the few young and single women was the daughter of the hosts, the Marquis, and his wife. It was a girl of short stature, just 5'2" feet tall, more or less thin, but with a beautiful body, a beautiful silhouette. With her bodice and generous neckline, she sported breasts that were quite big for her height and relative thinness. The young woman had white skin, the hair straight and dark brown, which was long to the shoulders but which she now was furled in an elegant compound hairstyle. Her face was sweet, smiling and childish, with beautiful dimples, giving her an appearance of being younger than she actually was. The girl appeared to be a teenager. Her brown eyes were beautiful and expressive. The dress she wore was dark blue and highlighted her skin very well, and her face. The girl was walking happily for the party in which she welcomed her father's guests to the hunting and party days that would last for more than a week. She talked enthusiastically with the guests and especially with the women. In a moment of the night, the girl approached her parents, when they were talking with a gentleman. The Marquis was a 70-year-old man, a very old age for the men of his era, although in his case he looked relatively well for his age. His hair was completely grey, and his face was fierce, though his features were obviously attractive in his now distant youth. His body had been very strong but now he had a slightly prominent belly. It was more or less tall. His wife, the Marchioness, was a woman a little over 10 years younger than her husband, but she also looked good for her age. She was much shorter than her husband, even a little shorter than her daughter. It was obvious to meet both of them from where the daughter had taken her height, and she was slightly chubby, although it was noticeable that her figure had been pretty when she was young, and she had big breasts like her daughter's. Her face was also similar to her daughter's, beautiful and sweet, although showing the signs of her age. "Come on, daughter, I want to introduce you to Mr. Peter Pemberton, a banker from Salisbury." "Mr. Pemberton, I introduce you my daughter Jane," said the Marquis in a friendly way, but with his usual firm voice. "It's a pleasure, Mr. Pemberton," said Jane with a charming smile and the elegant gesture of a lady when she was introduced to a gentleman. "The pleasure is mine, Lady Jane. Your father told me you were very beautiful, and now I think he fell short." "You have inherited the beauty of your mother," said Mr. Pemberton, bending to kiss the back of Jane's hand. "You are very flattering, Mr. Pemberton," Jane replied in the kind manner with which she had been taught to receive compliments. "I say the same, "You flatter me, but I think my Jane is more beautiful than I was at her age," said Jane's mother, the Marchioness. "Nonsense, mother. Surely you were a very beautiful woman, you still are," said Jane with a polite giggle. "I think they both are, my ladies," said Mr. Pemberton, a man about the age of the Marquis, fatter and rosy-cheeked in his face of a good-natured man. The conversation between the four ran on banalities until approached them a young man, about 30 years old, tall and more or less athletic, with light brown hair and blue eyes. The man was quite handsome. Jane could not help but see him with great interest when he approached. "Marquis, Marchioness, Lady Jane, allow me to introduce you to my nephew Thomas Northrop," said Mr. Pemberton. Thomas greeted the Marquis and the Marchioness with courtesy, and when it was Jane's turn he saw her with an intense gaze of ill-concealed desire, which disturbed Jane, whose heart quickened. "It's a pleasure, Lady Jane," Thomas said gallantly and with a charming smile, as he bent to kiss the back of Jane's hand, still looking at her with that intense, hypnotic gaze. Jane's whole body trembled, and she knew she had a problem.